Our first task here is a little bit of housekeeping, if you like. This felt piece tore away when I was taking the camera apart. You can see it was only glued in various places, so I need to glue that back in position. So what I'll do is I'll just put some adhesive on here and press that piece of felt back into place. With a bit of luck, this will all go fairly smoothly without too much mess. That's always the hope. And you could use any adhesive at all to do that job probably. No, epoxy probably wouldn't be the best. Right. And that'll do nicely. Okay, so start assembling some of this. First I'll put the finger on the side there that works the shutter release. Now you could lubricate this in a number of ways. Graphite pencil is a good way. Just rub some on the back. And some through the slots where the screws will go. Here there are two screws. The large head, the large diameter head goes at the top. The smaller diameter head goes at the bottom. Check that that moves freely, tighten the two screws up. Don't go mad, they're quite small. If you don't break the screw, you'll strip them out of the housing. And put its return spring in place. That screw head's a little bit less than wonderful looking. Yeah, that's in place. Tighten that screw up. That's our return spring, everything moving smoothly. Well, here's the next round. Now I've given these little springs just a slight stretch, very slight, to return them to something like their original oomph. And with some synthetic grease, I'll take this piece, some through the little hole in the centre, around the outside like that. Now the springs go in the holes of these buttons. Do not put them on the post. You put them on the post, nothing's going to go. The buttons are identical. One goes at the top and one goes at the bottom. I'm holding that spring compressed with my finger and thumb, and I need to slide this into the housing. Slides in like that, easy. Now, a bit of lubrication here's a good thing. On the rails, we need some lubrication. Top and bottom. And Where the buttons run, they run on this part, the centre. A little bit of lubrication there is a good thing. Particularly at the top where that track is. And then this should slide in and snap into place easily. Right, well that's ready to go into the body. So now to prepare the body. Well, here's the body, and the first piece to go in the body is the transfer shaft. This is the replacement for those broken pieces that I had. So I'll apply some synthetic grease to this. Try not to get it all over my fingers. This drops into that hole at the back of the body there at the top. And that's held in place with this little bracket. And that bracket is held in place with this little rounded head screw. It's the only one like it on the camera, quite short. See if I can tip this up. I'm holding that bracket underneath with my finger. Get that screw started. So I've got the screw started. That's the first step. Now we want our shutter cocking rack. I've got a used one here, which is looks quite usable. Pop that in there. Check that it moves smoothly. I'm taking a feeler gauge, 4/1000ths of an inch, which is 0.102 millimeters, it tells me. I'm sliding that in there to give me a little bit of clearance. Slacken that screw off, drag it backwards towards the back of the camera, tighten it up. Check that the arm moves freely, and it doesn't. I have insufficient clearance. I'm checking in here to see that this bracket is sitting square with the body and it's tipped to one side. That was the source of the stiffness there by the looks of it. I'll just check my spacing again. Now it's still too tight. That's better. That rack moves nice and smoothly. Check my brackets squared up. Now it's moved and it's tightened up. If you look down in there, you can see that that bracket's kicked over to one side. That's better. Moves nice and smoothly. I want to put a drop of lacquer on that screw to hold it in place so it doesn't shift. Right, my lacquer has done a runner. Actually, I know what happened to it. It's gone. Used up, dried up and gone. So I'm going to lock this with a nice daub of red paint instead. Well, that's very messy, but it'll do the job. Alright, so we've got that transfer shaft in place and we can put the front on the camera or the shroud. Now in this case, these two bushes were loose. Normally they're just press fitted into the housing. Now they're a D shape, they only fit in one direction and they should just be pressed in. They are not a particularly tight fit. They're easily disturbed when the camera is being taken apart. And they can be a nuisance because they'll fall out of position while you're trying to get things in place. Okay, next piece. This thing, it's called the sleeve, I think. It's part of the shutter release mechanism. It slides in here and then partly collapse the front of the camera to stop it from dropping in. We can take the body of the camera and slide this into position. There are 2 screw holes at the top, 2 at the bottom. Now, of the 4 screws that I've got here, 2 of them are dirty and ugly, and I know that they've come from underneath the Leatherette. Don't press on the screwdriver while you're trying to put these screws in, because you'll just move those bushes out of place. Where's that other one gone? There it is. So the ugliest screws at the bottom of the camera, where they'll be covered by the Leatherette. And with a bit of luck, your sins will never be found out. At the top of the camera, the screws in better condition. Though they're usually a little bit rough too, because they usually don't come out without a fight. So they're often abused. Again, don't put any weight on your screwdriver, because you will displace those bushes. This one here in particular is easily displaced. It's because there's not much metal around it, so it's not very stiffly held there. See if I can get that started. Ooh. Yes. Okay, so I've got all 4 screws started. I can tighten them up. And the 2 on the base. So that front section's all in. Now, this sleeve, this thing here, is inclined to fall out. If you put your shutter release shaft in there, now, it can't fall out. So we can open up the front. Looks like that'll pull up into position. That's looking good. When the front's extended, this sleeve, if this is not present, has a habit of falling into the bellows, causing you endless amounts of strife. You just don't want it. Okay, what else can we do while we're here? Well, the door on the front of the camera, we can put that in place. So I want some synthetic grease. Apply some to this groove at the front here, and the same on the base. Get my door in place. It just slides into those grooves. Swings into the body like that. Now we've got 2 screws and 1 washer. So I better find those. Yeah, there's one of the screws. Where's the washer? It was one of the heavier washers. And that goes on the top of the door. And then feed that back under there. line up the hole, and put the screw in position. I'm going to flip the camera. This is dangerous because at this point the shutter release could fall out. And we're going to flip the camera, and we don't need a washer at the bottom. There's only one washer usually fitted on these cameras. Just to take some slop out of the door, to take up excess clearance. Some cameras have two washers. Without dropping my shutter release, let's see if the front opens and closes. Transfer shaft there didn't drop through the hole. There's a little bit of play in it, so it didn't drop through this hole. It stopped the front plate from moving. That's why it wouldn't close. Alright, now temporarily I'm going to put the front part of the transfer shaft in place. So I'll put a tiny wipe of synthetic grease through there, and some on the shaft, some on that front edge. This goes over the end of the transfer shaft in the body. And then the little front housing here goes over the top. Those two screws, neither of those are in a pretty state because they'd been taken off by whoever's had the camera apart before, or partly apart. These two chromed screws, if one of them is considerably uglier than the other, put it down the bottom. You can never see that once the camera is assembled. Leave the pretty one up the top here where it can be seen. Right, so that'll guide that transfer shaft, so now the front will open and close smoothly. That's the front of our camera. That was easy enough. I think next we'll start on the film advance components. No, best of all, I'll put the tripod socket and the rewind on the top. The tripod socket's a good thing to put in early because otherwise every time your camera hits the bench, the button is pressed and the back flies open, and it makes them very frustrating to work on. I need to find a rubber band for this or I'm going to get into trouble. Let's just pop this over the top. That'll just stop this getting away. Alright, so that's in. Let's put the rewind on since we're at this end of the camera. I should have two screws for that. That should look same as this size, but they should look less battered because they shouldn't have had the same degree of abuse. And the bush. So I'll take some synthetic grease. This is the centre of our rewind shaft. Just run some synthetic grease on that. Feed it up into the base of the rewind. It's got a little tab on it, must line up with the slot in this shaft. And that should move relatively freely. Usually a bit freer than that. That lubricant will spread along there and free that up a bit. In this bush I'm using synthetic grease again. You could use graphite grease, you can use whatever you've got. checking that's moving nicely. Pop that on the top of the camera. Fit my 2 screws. As always, get your screws in position, all of them, then tighten them up. If you put one screw in and tighten it up, you can guarantee that the second hole is not lined up and it's not going to go. Okay, at the base of the camera we need to put this in position and this with the 3 screws. The 3 screws are flathead screws, countersunk head screws. They've got a plain piece on the shaft at the top. They're not the longest screws in the camera, but they're noticeably longer than the ones we just used. Okay, so this insert drops in there. Never mind about that tripod abuse signs there, that's not going to make any difference. No one's going to look down that hole and see those marks, and even if they could, they wouldn't know what to make of them. Right, all 3 screws are in place. Tighten them up. That's our tripod socket back in place. So now when it gets banged on the table, it won't pop apart. At this stage I'm going to move my rubber band down to here. That'll probably do, just to give me more room to get my film advance stuff into the camera body. Okay, film advance next. Here I have the lock lever and the release lever. Here's our release lever. Its job is to release the film advance to allow you to wind on to the next frame once you've made your exposure. I have to get this hook back over that little boss there. This is always awkward. That's just the nature of things. I'll bring it up on a block of wood here. Get it a bit closer where you can see it. So the little tail of it's got the hook on it. Has to hook under this edge here. And the loop hooks over that boss like that. It's looking good. Now its mate, this lever. This had been damaged because the camera had been thumped on its head. This had been driven into the base of the camera. This is while the camera was apart. And this is obviously bent down slightly. It's not bent down much. I'm just checking to see if it's loose on the shaft at all, because that could cause us problems. It's not loose on the shaft. I'll see if I can bend that up slightly. You could probably get away without doing that at all, but I prefer it to start in the right position. That'll probably do. Now to fit these into the camera body, I'm starting here with some molybdenum paste. And on the toothpick I'll run some down there, flip the body over, some in here, some in here, some in there, and on this front face is where that spring on the end of the release lever will run. We want it to move freely. So we'll pop the lock lever in first, drops in there, passes through the casting at the top of the camera and should move freely. I'm checking that it moves freely because we know it's a little bit bent. Now it appears to be okay. At the top of the camera we need to fit its spring. There are two similar looking springs, but the one made of lighter wire and with fewer coils is the one that goes on this. Now I can press this spring and hold it down with my thumb while I pick up the clip, E clip or C clip, in my tweezers, slide that into the groove and press it into place with the tail of my tweezers. And now our lever is sprung loaded and moves freely. Next, the release lever. Being careful not to catch this spring on the side of the body. Line this up with the hole in the bottom. You probably have to use a pair of tweezers to line it up at the top. See that spring trying to get in my way? And that is not moving freely at all, which suggests that there's something wrong with that. It suggests that it's bent. Let's have it back out. This is crushed in at the top anyway so that it grips its screw correctly, but this doesn't want to seem to slide in the body. Checking for roughness. Distortion at the top here probably won't cause us any problems because it's above the height we need it to be. Let's try that again. See if it feeds in from the top. It does. Let's make sure that there's nothing in here causing us a problem. Shouldn't be. I'll feed it in from the bottom again. That feels alright. So I'll fit its return spring on the top. It has more coils and is a thicker wire than the spring on the lock lever. And get the screw started. This isn't always easy. You're trying to get it into started in a hole which is slightly smaller than the screw because it's been pinched shut. That's alright, it's started. That looks like that's okay. Now, as for the height of that release button there, if the shutter release is lifted up to the top of its stroke, let's just take that rubber band off for the moment, hopefully not flick the thing away. This arm should come round on top of that screw head. So it needs to be sit on the top of it. That'll do nicely. Just put the rubber band back where it came from. Okay, so that's the lock and release lever back in the body. Move on to the next bit. Right, well, we'll get the take-up spool in next. So what's involved in this? Well, the bush goes into the base of the take-up spool, the metal bush. The top has a slot in it. The base is circular, it goes into the base. Put that to one side. Here is the film advanced shaft. This is all nice and clean now from the ultrasonic cleaner. It was sticky with dirty old grease before. Just checking this. Make sure that this is firm. If the camera has been dropped on its base, if the film advance lever's hit the ground at some stage, this can be loose on the shaft. That'll cause you problems. If it is loose on the shaft, the answer is to use a punch and just stake this down a little bit more in the middle. It'll usually get you by. Sometimes if the shaft is damaged because it's taken a really good thump, it's going to have to be replaced. But I want to lubricate that with some synthetic grease. So usually I'd go about that by pulling the spring back up out of the way, putting some on the shaft and working that in. I want to run some onto the spring itself, because as this is rotated and the spring winds up, those coils will bind together. And normally I put some on the little ratchet teeth, if you like, here on the underside. And you can do the top side too, though chances are most of this will get rubbed off on your fingers. Okay, now almost certainly this is rotated until the pins are sticking up and catching on those holes. Lift it up so it's free. We want to line up the holes here with the holes in the base plate there. Alright, bring in the camera body. Give the camera, drop your film take-up spool in place, the bush at the bottom, and our advanced shaft can be dropped into position. Now, where does this need to sit? Even get this thing in focus. I'll have to do. There's two notches, one here and one here. This one is for our release lever, the other one is for our lock lever. Now, without disturbing this, I can install the 3 screws. Now there's no tension wound up on the spring of that film advance at the moment. We do that afterwards. As always, get all 3 screws installed, then go back and tighten things up. Oh, just heard trouble. Lucky we got the front of the camera closed. The rewind pushed in, the rubber band came off, and my shutter release has fallen out. Oh well, we got away with it that time. Don't do it again. Let's make that a little bit more secure so evil things don't happen. I will temporarily put the strap plug on at this end of the body. Because it's better to hook the rubber band around. Okay, it just makes it a bit more secure while I'm working on the camera. Back to our film advance. Let's carry on where we left off. Right, the components on the top of that shaft can go on next. Now at this stage, get something here. Whenever you're working on this, it's easy to push this shaft down and disengage things. So I normally put that tripod mount surround down underneath there. That just supports that shaft, stops it pushing down, stops it causing a problem for me. Okay, to assemble the next lot of parts for the film advance, we need to assemble that clutch. That clutch is what provides our controlled slippage on the take-up spool. So I'll just wipe some synthetic grease around the inside of that. You can use graphite grease, you can use what you've got. Now getting this spring in place is entertaining. That little tab on the top of that spring drops into that notch. Then I take my crimp lug pliers, lower that on from the top, squeeze it gently and rotate this to pull that spring into place. Taking this drum, you can see the groove on that surface, that goes down. Slide that over the top. There is our clutch assembled, and it'll move smoothly in one direction, not so well in the other. That's fine because that's the direction we need it to move in. You can't put it in back to front. I'll wipe some synthetic grease through the centre of that, just check that I've got this sitting on there. Drop my drum assembly in place. Now the upper bush for our film advance, I'll run a little bit of synthetic grease through the centre, and where that gear set is on it, these two pinions, I'll put a blob of grease there, squeeze that with my thumb, and then the hydraulic pressure will just push that into place, and drop this into the camera. Open the back of the camera and rotate the take-up spool with my thumb. You can see it rotates this gear. It allows this to drop in, allows things to line up and fall into place. Screws to hold the bush in place. We have this one, this post. This also supports the cocking rack, keeps it in firm contact with the gear on the top of the film advance. And on the other side, we have a little bush, a little pinion, and the screw that holds it together. That bush, one side has got a countersink on it. That must go down. The plain side must be up. Otherwise the little pinion, the little pawl here will not work. Put that on the top. Normally I just take a little spot of grease, stick it on that screw, and the screw passes down through the pawl, through the bush, through the upper film advance bush here and into the camera body. I'm not tightening those screws up tight yet, I just need to get them in place and check that that pawl moves freely. That looks good. Now the return spring for that pawl, that's interesting because that was very damaged. That was this little one here. And it's very mutilated looking. Let's get it on something you can see. Will it catch the light there? Yeah, you can. It's quite mutilated. I could spend some time straightening that up, but I've probably got plenty of spares. Let me go and get a spare. Okay, well, here's a good spring. Here's the spring out of the camera. You can see what I'd need to do is straighten out all this bent piece here, and that would probably work okay, but I really can't be bothered with that today. We'll take the good spring that we've got here and put this in the camera. Okay, so this spring goes over that screw head. It goes into that groove around the screw head. The long leg comes against the body here and the short leg is on this side of the pawl. So it pushes the pawl towards the centre. That's looking good. Next up this gear. I'm just running a little bit of synthetic grease under the edge of that. And if we rotate this counterclockwise, it should push the pawl out of the way as it drops into place, like that. Next, we have this spring, which I normally give a little wipe of grease to. Not because it needs to be lubricated, more just to make sure it doesn't suffer from corrosion. High carbon steels are great at corroding. That piece goes on. The bevels on this piece are facing up. This little piece goes on. This washer the gear for the centre of the film advance shaft fits over the square nicely, and then this screw goes on the top. Now I've got a special screwdriver here, which is just a very simple modification, just a screwdriver with the centre ground out basically to leave two rectangular points to engage those 2 points on the screw. Alright, so that's in place. Now because the lock lever is locking the film advance shaft, I can tighten that screw up. And that's that done. Just checking that my rubber band's in place. Let's flip the camera over. The shutter release is trying to get to depress, and it'll push up that release lever if I'm not careful. Let's see if I can prop this up on something. That will do. Let's get you back in focus.